So like I said, today's gonna be a bit different. I just got back from Ukraine about a week and a half ago, and I've done a lot of international trips, and I'll tell you, this one has, for a variety of reasons, sparked more interest, and I've had more questions about what we experienced, what we went through, and really what next steps are for us as a church and what's happening there in Ukraine. And so we decided as a teaching team and as a programming team that we would kind of push the First Peter series back a week. We saw baptism next week, and then we'll resume the First Peter series the week after baptism. And I just want to take the morning to share just the opportunity that we had there in Ukraine and what we believe God has for us next there. Now, maybe you're not aware of how we got connected in Ukraine. Well, back at the beginning of, or in February of 2020, when this full-scale invasion happened there, we were really asking God, what part do you want us to play? We felt like there was something he had for us, but what we really sensed was God saying, hey, I've got something for you, just not yet. And so we waited, and we were just waiting for God to show us what the steps would look like and where we could join in what God was doing in the nation Ukraine and serving the people of Ukraine. And so during that time of waiting, God introduced us to this gentleman. His name is Andre. Andre and his wife Albina, they were missionaries in Russia. They're from Ukraine, but originally missionaries in Russia for over 20 years. And then when the tensions started rising between Russia and Ukraine, they left Russia and moved into Ukraine. But God was speaking to Andre and Albina that they were to minister to serve the people of Ukraine. And then the war broke out in Ukraine. And so Andre felt like he needed to get his wife and his youngest daughter out of the country. And they became refugees here in the United States. In fact, where they ended up living was just about 20 miles or 20 minutes down the road from our Bedford location. And it was there that we, through some mutual organizations that we've served alongside and through, that we met Albina and we heard their story. And then the beginning of this last year, 2023, Andre was here with a visa, short-term visa, so he could see his family. And there we were able to get with him. We brought a film crew down and we captured his story and really just felt like there was, okay, God was doing something here. We got to hear his heart for, I'll go more in depth in this, but this is the city of Kharkiv, which is about 40 kilometers away from the Russian border, which is all of this right here. It was one of the first cities hit. And while he's not from that city, when the war broke out, he felt like God had called him to serve the people here, specifically in the Saltivka, which is a suburb of Kharkiv, a northern suburb that's even closer and was one of the hardest early hit places, and serve those people. And so he shared his heart during this interview we had with him, and just he shared his story, shared his heart. And we just felt like there was, okay, God was doing something here, and there was a next step we could take. So I believe it was March of this last year of 2023 that we shared his story. And from there, from March till mid-July, through your generosity, we raised nearly $50,000 to help support what they were then calling relief centers. They have two. They were just launching a second one, and they invited us to be a part of supporting that second relief center. Now they call them family centers, and I'll talk more about that. And we've just watched God. Along with that, we were able to raise money between us and Gospel Community Church, money for 800 med kits that we were going to get to the soldiers on the front lines there in Ukraine. But we felt strongly that, it wasn't enough just to send money, but to really go there, see what Andre and his team were doing, but not just see what Andre's team was doing, but look soldiers in the eyes and say, hey, with a med kit, be like, hey, you're not forgotten, you're seen, God loves you kind of idea. And not just to do that, but to see people all throughout Ukraine and hear the story of what God is doing in the midst of this war over there in Ukraine. And so August 24th, my birthday, a small team of us, myself, and two churches here. Myself and Josh, our film guy here from Blue Ridge, we are part of the Blue Ridge team. And then Gospel Community, Andrew and Seth were a part of that team. Now, Andrew is one of the pastors at Gospel Community, and he's actually originally from Ukraine. He and his family, they moved here in the second grade, when he was in the second grade, to upstate New York. And so he actually was on the ground in Ukraine, serving the people, getting connected 30 days after the war began in February. So he's been over, I think, think this was his 4th time. So he had a lot of connections that we could connect with, that he was introducing us to, so that we could find our way and just again, get a full view of what God was doing. So I don't know about you, but before all of this, I wasn't that familiar with the country of Ukraine. And so kind of to show you our journey, these aren't all the cities in Ukraine, but these were the major places we hit, and it kind of gives you oriented to Ukraine and what it's like, or at least kind of some of the geography. We flew into Warsaw, Poland, because you can't fly into actually Ukraine right now. And we had a driver that took us into this western city of Lviv. And from there, we spent one night in Lviv. And from there, we headed over to Kyiv, did some events in and outside of Kyiv there. From there, then we started making our way east. And so if you want to know where the war is at right now, basically, Kupiansk, Bakhmut, Donetsk, Kherson, these pretty much mark the front lines. That either all of these cities are now Russian occupied, or the majority of them. And so this is the front lines of kind of the war there right now. And we were able to travel from here all the way down through here and all the way south. Around Dnipro right here, I actually split off from the rest of our group. They continued south down to Kherson. And I went back up to Kyiv, where I spent like 3 days with Andre and the team there, seeing what they were doing at these family centers, the previous relief centers, specifically the family center number 2 that we support, just seeing all that was going on. Now, that kind of gets you oriented to where things are at, the cities we traveled to, but give you a little bit more, and I'm gonna be really sharing just people's stories, because that's what I believe is most important. But one thing I didn't know is, you wanna know what Ukraine looks like. Outside of the cities, this is it. Like, I didn't realize Ukraine would be so flat. It is the number 1 exporter of sunflower seed and sunflower seed oil. So like, this is Ukraine. Ukraine is the 2nd largest European country, I believe. And it really looks like, basically, if you've traveled through the Midwest, that it's farming communities all throughout, with cities littered in between. In fact, if you know what the Ukrainian flag looks like, the yellow and the blue, this is the inspiration right here. Their yellow fields and their blue skies. So that was a lot of what Ukraine was outside of the city. But like I said, really, this is not about the geography of Ukraine, but it's about the people of Ukraine. And for me, this picture right here would sum up really what we experienced in Ukraine. This was actually in the city of Lviv, so this western city over here. And it was actually on our last day, as we were circling around and coming back. We were leaving the city of Lviv, or we were getting on a bus here in Lviv so that we could take it over into Warsaw, Poland, catch our flight back to the United States. And this is one of the last pictures we took that was taken by our team inside of Ukraine. And what it was, as we were sitting on this bus, there was a young family in front of us and waiting for the bus to leave. And there's this 4-year-old, and his mom was sitting next to him. And then his dad, who you see here, was standing at the door of the bus. And it was a small bus, and it was kind of warm and stuffy on the side. We were a little delayed getting going. So we just assumed he was waiting, until the bus got going, until it closed its doors, and then he was gonna sit down next to his family. But when they announced that we were just a couple of minutes away from leaving, he actually got off the bus and went around to the window, and there he's drawing hearts on the window with his 4-year-old. And in that moment, we clue into what's really happening here. And that is that he's a soldier, and this is his young family. And while has been fighting, or is going to be fighting, he's getting his family out of Ukraine to safety. And the reason why I shared this photo is because this is really the story of the vast majority of the Ukrainian people, of what they're experiencing. They're on one side of this tension, this equation, or the other. That either they're the soldier that's fighting, who's concerned for their own safety, but also the safety of their family, or it's the civilian who has a husband or a wife or a son or a daughter or a grandchild or a grandfather, or a very close friend who's fighting, that they're concerned, as a civilian's concerned about the safety of that loved one that's fighting, while also going, what do we do? Do we stay? Do we go? What about our kids? The safety, and you just feel that, and they've been living in this tension for the last 1.5 years as Russia invaded. And then you add to that Not only this, but followers of Jesus, the church there in Ukraine. And what you have the church doing is they're living in this same reality themselves. This is their story. They're either civilians or soldiers that they know, or they're living in that same tension, but they're trying to push that aside to serve families like this. And that's what we got to see over and over and over again. And Ukraine is just kind of this big juxtaposition. It's, you just kind of feel like whiplash going from place to place because it's a country at war that's been invaded, but then it's also a place that's trying to figure out how to keep daily life going. And so you see things like this. This is in the city of Kharkiv, where Andre is up here in the city of Kharkiv. And this is a memorial that's set up for children who've lost their lives over the last year. And it's at the base of the memorial that families bring these stuffed animals there in memory of the children that have been lost. Or you're in this moment where right here, I'm talking with this soldier, and he has just shared with me that he's got a young wife, and his daughter, I think, is 5 years old. So he's got a daughter, and we're looking up photos of our families here, and we're on the front, near the front lines, within a couple kilometers of the front lines here, and we're showing each other our families. And the reason why we're showing each other families is because he's just shared that in the opening weeks of the war, his unit was stationed just 5 kilometers from the town in which his wife and his daughter lived. That's the tension. Worrying about their safety, worrying about his own life. They're worried about him while worried about their own safety in the midst of all of that. It's things like this. You see, I had just got done speaking at a church. It's a church of about 115 people in attendance that day. And I finished up speaking. And after I finished up speaking, the Ukrainian pastor, he stands up and he says something, and they start shouting out stuff that I can't understand. They're speaking actually Russian there. They're speaking Russian there. And I can't understand what they're saying. And so I asked my translator, Andre, our partner, I asked him, what are they talking about? Or what is the audience shouting out? And this is just a list of names of people just from that small community that are fighting in the war right now as we speak. And we're gonna list all their names out, and we're getting ready to pray for them as they go through this. And then you get thrown into something like this. This is the city of Lviv on our first day there, and this could be a beautiful Eastern European city. It is a beautiful Eastern European city. Little boy playing in a fountain, could be downtown Lynchburg, and then you can have air raid sirens, which did go off multiple times as you're there in this city and in this space. Then you take that and you're traveling down the road, and you just see, this is actually, we were outside of here, there was Kupiansk here. We were headed into one of the places that would be shelled while we were there, and passing us going in basically for the night shift is this unit to relieve other soldiers going to the front lines. In fact, 6 o'clock in the morning down here, we were in Kramatorsk. We heard while these were really the front lines, and we were about 20 or 30 miles away here, this was getting shelled all throughout the night around us. We heard shells going off all around the night, explosions, artillery, those kinds of things. And some point during the night, a Russian unit or whoever came into the city, and so this was our alarm clock in the morning. Just a neighborhood or so over from us. And you've got civilian cars driving down the road. And this went on for 2 hours. This is just a couple minute clip of 2 hours. Or we were leaving a region that was, because we had to take a different direction because the road we were planning on taking was being shelled. And so we're taking a different road, and we're leaving a city that had just gotten shelled. And I was trying to get video of some of the explosions, and then we see, just randomly, you'll see it, a tank goes by, going into the city with civilians following right after that. That's just reality. In fact, you're traveling down these roads like that, and you feel like you're traveling with rumble strips, because you know the places where a lot of battles have taken place, because tanks have dug into the pavement from the amount that have gone through there. And this is the environment in which most Ukrainians are trying to exist and live, while they're either the soldiers or they're the civilians. And then you've got the church there in between, trying to deal with their own circumstances day to day, which is this reality, while trying to serve the people. In fact, one of the clearest pictures of that is Tanya's story here. Tanya, they're interviewing her right here, having her tell her story. In the first couple weeks of the war, her husband, who is a soldier, was captured by the Russians and has been in a Russian prison camp ever since the opening weeks of the war. And unfortunately for them as a family, he's not high enough up, doesn't have enough intel, and they're not wealthy enough. So really, there's nothing to really incentivize the Russians or the Ukrainians to barter a trade for him, a prisoner swap. And so she's gone all through the government, exhausted all of her resources. And the last she's heard of him was about a month and a half ago, where she was talking to some soldiers that had been swapped, who had been in the same prisoner camp. And they had confirmed that her husband and all of them had been tortured for information, and that her husband's health was declining. And Tanya here, she's not a follower of Jesus. And right now in this moment, followers of Jesus who are walking through their own stories, many like this, are setting aside those things to care for Tanya in her physical, emotional, and spiritual needs in the midst of all of this. In fact, the followers of Jesus are surrounding her and seeing what connections they have, government officials and things like that, to try to negotiate some sort of trade for her husband in this. And this is what we saw over and over and over again. And it was a heartbreaking thing, like a devastating thing, and then also you're just standing in awe of the followers of Jesus who are living this and yet saying, you know what? We're not circling in on ourselves. We're looking for ways to care for the Tanyas in there. People like that. And there's just example after example of that. This is actually Lviv on our first day. We're here in Lviv. While it's not regularly being bombed, they may get air raids and things like that and get missiles lobbed in there every now and again. Their deal within the war has been the amount of people that have gone from the east and have now moved over here by the hundreds of thousands into the west, many of whom can't get out of the country. And so here you have Adam and Zhenya. Adam's a pastor, Zhenya's a volunteer there at their church. And Adam described in the early parts of the war in his 2-bedroom apartment how he had around 60 people in his 2-bedroom apartment with him and his family sleeping on the floor, most of whom he didn't know. Just refugees. Zhenya describes a moment where Zhenya wasn't originally from Lviv. He was actually more from the east. I can't remember which town he was from, but he was from the east. And he describes how in the early parts of the war, he was a counselor before the war. And so he's counseling this guy through Zoom during the invasion, early parts of the invasion. And this man starts opening up. I can't remember if it's about his kids or his marriage, but something like this man's finally being vulnerable for the very first time. And the man starts to weep in this moment. And right about the time that this man starts to weep, the neighborhood and the town that Jen is in is getting artillery fire all over it, like bombs dropped on it. And Zhenya has to make a decision. Do I interrupt this guy because I'm scared for my own life and say, hey, we're gonna have to reschedule this? Or do I sit in this moment? And he chose to sit in the moment with this guy. This church that's there in Lviv, they had a crisis pregnancy ministry before the war, and basically they've opened that up to any pregnancy now in Ukraine, because every pregnancy is a crisis pregnancy, whether it's because somebody's fighting, it's a widow now, a young widower or widow there, or it's just a lack of medical supplies. The church has just said, this is what we can do, that we can just transition this into something new. Zhenya and his team and the church there were dealing with orphans prior to the war, and now obviously the orphan crisis, and so they're teaching them life skills and all sorts of different things like that now as in the midst of the war. This is our driver Sergey. And he was much more than just a driver. He in Ukraine, he lived in the city of Dnipro over here, and But he owns a video security company. He's also a volunteer pastor at the church he serves at there in Dnipro. And in the early part of the war, as the Russians were moving to here, he has a young family. I think his daughter's like 6 years old, wife. So they moved west. He got his wife and his daughter out, but while they're moving west and while this invasion is happening, he's having to answer questions for his 6-year-old daughter. He's asking questions like, why do the Russians hate us so much that they want to kill us? And those are the types of conversations you're trying to, while you're trying to get your family to safety. Then he's there because he doesn't want to leave. He's there in Lviv for about a month. And then a friend of his says, hey, we can't just sit here and do nothing. And so you see in vans like these and civilian vehicles like these, they start grabbing supplies from the west, and then they start making their way into the front lines, oftentimes behind enemy lines, especially in the early days, and dropping off supplies and then getting refugees out of these places and getting them back west. In fact, one of his stories that just are heartbreaking is early on they were in a town in the north here that had been recently liberated. For several months, the Russian soldiers had occupied this soldier. And before all the atrocities were coming out in the news, because this was early on in the war, this city was liberated, and they were on the front end of volunteers getting in there to serve the people that had recently been liberated and to bring food and things like that. And they expected to find death and buildings exploded and things like that. What they didn't expect to find was a whole town of women who had been sexually assaulted by the Russian soldiers were there. And they're trying to figure out, God, how do we ourselves process this? And what are we equipped with truly to help care for these women in the midst of this chaos? And yet for the last year and a half, these are the kinds of things that they're just continuing to do. This guy, his call sign, he's a medic in the military. His call sign is Pixel. It's like calling someone Little John, just a pixel. Obviously he's not that small. We're laughing here because I said they call me half a pixel in this case. But he's been, like where we were talking here, he's on the front lines here in one of the hottest zones, Donetsk, and under cover of night, he gets in his armored truck out by himself, and he heads out into the fields at night, into the battlefields at night, and he picks up civilians that are wounded, Ukrainian soldiers that are wounded, and even Russian soldiers that are wounded. And he's a follower of Jesus, and as he's with them, he's caring for their physical needs, while also knowing that for a lot of them, this is gonna be their final moments, maybe the last voice they hear. And so he's sharing the hope of the gospel inside of him with them. This guy right here, his name is Sasha. And you'll hear me talk about other Sashas probably. That's because at any event you could say Sasha and 60 Ukrainian men would turn their head towards you. Okay, so his name is Sasha, and we're doing a children's event outside of Kyiv. I'm talking to about 120 kids right here, telling the story of Zacchaeus, saying, hey, I want you to know God sees you just like he saw Zacchaeus. Nobody's too far from God, just like Zacchaeus wasn't too far. And he's translating for me. And a couple days later, I thought he was just my translator. I only was with him for a couple hours that day, but a couple days later, somebody's telling me his story, and the church is putting us on. They're called Freedom Church, and before the war, they were a church of about 150 people, and this church of 150 people at times are caring for 750, 1,000 refugees in their town as they came from the east and moved into the west and displaced people. And of the 150 people that were a part of their church, Sasha's his salary or his job was the only job in that church that was not disrupted because of the war. He's a lawyer for a foreign company. And so currently right now, and this is what somebody else was telling me several days later who knew him, said right now he's the only one supporting the financial needs of that community of faith. And the reason we were there and even doing that is because he was using his own funds for the children that day. And this is the kind of stuff, again, you're dealing with the tragicness of war, but you're also going, man, God, look at the faith and the desire of the church, Ukrainian followers of Jesus, to serve people around them. This is David. David's a 26-year-old young man, and David, in the early parts of the war, was getting supplies to the front lines. And I think early on, a commanding officer of one of the units he was supplying with some stuff said to him, David, you're more important to us doing what you're doing right here than just another body thrown to the front lines. So keep on doing what you're doing. And so that's what he's been doing over the last year and a half. And David's a follower of Jesus, and he's been bringing supplies. And here's the deal. David is one of the reasons that we were able to take these med kits and look soldiers in the eyes and say, hey, there is a God who loves you and cares for you. He sees you. And I promise you that we're proof that he sees you in this. And to pray with soldiers and do those types of things. You see, we couldn't have just shown up as Americans. They've been like, hey, we want to see some soldiers at the front lines. Can we get up there? Can we get a pass now? It's because of the relationships he's built and the equity that he has, because there is a need for all sorts of supplies of the Ukrainian army. This is a pretty average site right here. This is, again, one of the front line. I think this one was outside of Bakhmut here, right here. We actually had to move locations to this park because Russians were, we were told that the gas station we were at was being targeted by Russians artillery. And so we had to move to a park, and we're interviewing some soldiers while we're here. And we just took a picture of their vehicle, because this is what you see all over the place. You might this is just a civilian Mitsubishi that's been spray painted in camouflage, because the reality is you might get a Humvee, American offered Humvee when your regiment or your unit is first established and sent off, but after that's destroyed or things like that, the likelihood of supplies making it to the front lines is highly unlikely. So they have to find abandoned vehicles, spray paint them, buy them, usually with their own money. One soldier we were talking to, he had about $30,000 to $40,000 at the beginning of the war, but in the first 4 months, he had nothing saved, because he had for his unit alone, he had to buy 4 different vehicles so they could get around to keep the invading armies at bay and get to where their orders were in this process. And so there's a huge need for people like David. So David was able to connect us with all sorts of different soldiers. This is us taking supplies to a group of soldiers. Got energy drinks, Snicker bars, all that kind of stuff, plus the med kits. And the reality is, right here, we're getting ready to decide how many med kits we can leave, because most units could have used all the med kits, all 800 that we brought, or at least a majority of them. And we're going, okay, we can give you 30, or we can give you 50, we can give you 60. But this really cool thing was happening. In fact, we wondered if, you wonder, are they really getting where they need to go? And this was actually just sent to us last night. This was just sent to us, and this is a grainy picture because it wasn't taken by us, but what you have here is soldiers who are actually getting the med kits that we have in here. And if you can see here, there's white things in this guy's hand up in the front left, and it's a piece of paper because they went through and laminated verses in there. About Jesus in there that would give something for these soldiers beyond just these medical supplies in this. And the interesting thing is, this is part of Andre's story, our partner over there, that he was in the military. He got just a small piece of a portion of the book of John. And that was enough to start him on his journey towards Jesus while he was actually in the military. Actually, another one here, you see the guys, they've even blurred out the background because they don't want to give away where they're at. They're in their ghillie suits, but they're holding the med supplies that we were able to provide. And so we were able to have opportunities like this, but they even went beyond it. So this is a colonel of the 110th, this Ukrainian artillery division there, that's down in the Donetsk area. And we're interviewing him, hearing his story, all of that. And actually, his soldiers, these are his soldiers right here. They're part of his group. These are just soldiers that help us get to the front lines. We're just a couple kilometers away from literally where Russian soldiers are based at this point. And this is a volunteer regiment, a volunteer unit. And basically, we asked them, why do they fight? And they said, well, we didn't have to be here. We chose to be here because we're up here so that our friends, our family, our wives, our daughters, our sons, our grandparents, and our parents don't have to be. And while we're there and while we're doing this interview right here with this colonel outside of this area, actually Russian artillery zeroes in on our location. And probably the closest call we had was about an artillery explosion about 100 yards away from where we were located, and it had moved in closer and closer and closer. And so he's like, okay, it's time for us to go, guys. But when we got back to their base, this is what we had the opportunity. We had the opportunity to pray over these commanding officers, leave them the gifts of the medical kits that you all provided. And in fact, this really cool kind of symbiotic thing was happening. This is the colonel's back here. This is the colonel's boss. I don't know what his rank was, but he was the colonel's boss. And then this is David right here, this young man that's built these inroads into this place. And David got us into these spaces, knew what the soldiers needed, got us to the front lines all throughout these cities and these places so that we could have these opportunities to pray alongside these soldiers, to pray with them, to say, God sees you. But then another thing was happening because David was bringing Americans, and because where the Americans are viewed in Ukraine in such a positive light, it legitimized and even gave David even more of a platform for these continued relationships as a follower of Jesus, to continue to be a part of what's going on there. And what we really saw, and this passage just came alive for me in a whole nother way through my time, or through our time there. If you remember when the Israelites, they came out of Egypt, and they crossed the Red Sea, and they went in this land between into the desert before God delivered them into the promised land. They got into their first battle. And you read this, it says, so Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the, Aaron and Hur went to the top of the hill. As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on one side and one on the other, so that his hands remained steady till sunset. So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. And this is really took on a very literal picture in my brain as I was watching this stuff play out. And I know you could split this different ways, but for me, this is how it made sense in what I was viewing. Here you had the Joshuas on the front lines that were fighting, literally with the sword, fighting up front with the weapons. And then you had the Moses, the followers of Jesus, the church, that were trying to figure out how to support what was happening, what Joshua was going, what the Joshuas were experiencing, while also trying to take care of the civilians and the families and all of that. And they've been doing this for 1.5 years, and their hands are growing weary. And what was shocking to me is us just being over there for like 2 weeks. To a degree I couldn't have imagined before we went, that us just being over there with them, bringing over what feels like a drop in the bucket of what they actually need, was like us sliding a stone under Moses and saying, hey, we're here with you. Just rest for a bit. We can hold your arms up in a way. In fact, even as I was communicating to different people that I connected with in Ukraine that this would be happening today, it was like that, holding up their arms, that their stories being told, that people, the world's not forgetting about them, that there are churches and people praying for them, praying for God to work and giving of their own resources to support them. It's this whole thing of Aaron, Hur, Moses, and Joshua. And I got to experience that through our partner there, Andre and his team. If you remember, I said they've got 2 sites. And so when we got down to this Dnipro area, I split off from the team. I came back up here to Kharkiv and the Saltivka region up here, where Andre is planting these family centers. And there's 2, the first one and the second one, which Blue Ridge fully funds right now. And this is the team from the first site. And you've got this gentleman here in the blue. He does kind of outdoor sports stuff, events, kayaking. I mean, again, they're trying to care not just for the spiritual, but the whole person, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. So he does kind of outdoor rec kind of stuff. Here's Andre, our partner. This is Vladimir and his wife, Tanya, and the pastor here that leads the first site. This is Olga. She does the trauma healing class because they got a trauma healing, again, the full person. And this is, I knew I was gonna, Vitaly. This is Vitaly, and Vitaly, he leads music and just does anything. He's a young man, orphan, tragic story, but just does anything he can to serve the people there at the first site. In fact, I had them, they couldn't say hello in English because they can't speak English, but I just had them wave the Sunday I was speaking in front of you. You'll notice this is primarily an older population because they have these things outside. It's basically the suburbs, but they're from the Soviet era. And what they are, these large kind of apartment buildings. And in these apartment buildings, you might stand on a city corner and you see a whole city block, and there might be 60,000 people in, they call them micro-regions or micro-rayons, and there might be 60,000 people in that one, and 60,000 people across the street in that one, and 60,000 people over here, and another 50 behind you. And you might see 200,000 people just by looking around you. And of those 200,000 people, there is maybe one gospel-centered church among those 200,000 people. And so he's in the inroads, and so, or in these inroads into these communities. And so the microregion that this first site was put in is primarily made up of people at this point that were too old to leave, too poor to leave, those types of things. And so, but you see God working among them. This woman's named Anna. She came to Christ. She's a part of their baptism class. This is Helena. She's came to Christ, a part of their baptism class. The woman on to the as you're looking at her on the right, this is Marina. She came to Christ as a part of their baptism class. The woman on the left, she hasn't yet come to follow Jesus yet, but she was in one of these apartment complexes, and her husband went out one morning to go run some errands, and 5 hours after they left that apartment, a Russian missile came through and destroyed half of their building, including their apartment, and they would have been dead. And she said, before the war, I would have never associated with with this type of people group. But because of the war, I'm now here and in community and learning about all this stuff. And she's on her way. This is Yana. Yana, she isn't a follower of Jesus yet, but she had studied but when Ukraine was still a part of the Soviet Union, she studied at a Soviet Union music conservatory. And so they invited her, because they don't have anybody to do any music other than Vitaly to sing. And so they invited her to come play and be a part of the community. And so she's joining in, she's playing the songs, teaching the songs, hearing this message, and her heart softening to the message of who Jesus is. But that's the first site. This is the team that makes up the second site. Right here, the gentleman, this is Oleg and his family. I practice all their names. I can't say him. So Oleg and his family, his wife right here, his daughter, his son, and his son's girlfriend. And this is pretty much the team for the second site that we support there. Now, really cool thing here is Oleg, he's just this magnetic personality. I mean, he is just outgoing, people person, resonates with me. He couldn't speak a lick of English. We just smiled and laughed at each other constantly. And we just got it. We just were communicating as we were smiling and laughing together. And we just knew it. We'd pat each other on the backs, and I mean, I just really enjoyed him. But his story is he and his family are from the Kherson region down here in the south. And this was, and this city, actually where the dam broke and we sent a boat, there's a river and lake that runs through the south of Kherson, southeast of Kherson. And he lived on this side where the Russians still occupied and still do. And so he and his wife, his daughter who's in the striped shirt, she was at university up in Kharkiv. And when the war broke out, she moved into a basement of the church she was attending, because they had 60 refugees in the basement. And so Oleg, his wife, and his son, they escaped from the occupied Russian side, and instead of going west like was common, they moved up northeast towards their daughter, into Kharkiv, and there went to this church that was housing their daughter and was attending that church, and that's where they met Andre. And Andre on their journey up as they're escaping, Oleg, he was in real estate. And one of the things he was saying to his wife as they were journeying up to Kharkiv is that, hey, I think God doesn't want me to move back into real estate or business or anything, but I think there's something in ministry he has for me. He didn't know what that was. So he meets Andre up at this church that Andre goes to, because that became the first sending church for their first family center. And so he meets Andre up there, and Andre is watching Oleg, doesn't know this part of his story, but is watching Oleg and the way that he interacts with people who are far from Jesus, and he loves that. And he's like, I need that guy. And he taps him on the shoulder and says, hey, would you want to join me in this? And Oleg's like, yes, I felt like there was something else that God had for me. Now, in the meantime, as they start journeying towards that reality, Oleg starts to get cold feet, worried about how's he gonna provide for his family. There was no finances. Blue Ridge wasn't supporting anything, didn't know anything about Blue Ridge at that point. And so he goes to Andre and says, hey, I don't think I can do this. I'm gonna back out of this. I'm not sure, I gotta provide for my family. And Andre says, why don't you just pray about it? And so Oleg prayed about it. And Oleg came back and said, you're right, I heard from God the first time, I'm supposed to do this, he'll provide. A couple months later, God provides Blue Ridge to support the second site. It's just seeing God do all sorts of things. Now, this second site, I love it. It's so unique. Looks like they took over Ukrainians' version of a rainforest cafe, okay? Which forces them to think completely outside of the box of like how to do church. And so they are reaching an entirely different population because of the microregion around them. They're reaching, and the facilities that they've got, they're reaching high school, middle school students, young families with young kids. They're doing all sorts of things here. This is like a 2-minute long video, but this is right before they're getting ready to do, like they're doing a parenting class, a value-based parenting class. And at this value-based parenting class, during the first several months of it, they didn't even tell them, like they didn't open the Bible, they didn't mention the Bible. They just said there were these values on parenting because most of the people they were ministering to or teaching this were people far away from Jesus. And so they just would teach them biblically based values, but just teach the value of it. And then about a couple months ago, they started saying, hey, you know, there's this ancient book that kind of talks about these things. Could we open that up? And they opened it up and transitioned it into scripture. And now it's expected, like the people that still primarily aren't followers of Jesus, but young families that are there, that are looking for community, connection, still how to be parents in the midst of a war-torn country, are going, yes, Andre and Oleg said it's surprising now when we don't open up the Bible, they go, wait, where they ask them to say, hey, where is that in there? Or what is some wisdom from it that they're experiencing? In fact, I love, this is their largest room right here. So it forces them to think completely different about their gatherings on a Sunday morning. Imagine that being your auditorium right there. That's it. You know what they do? And we didn't know this, we didn't push this. You know what they do on a Sunday morning? They gather around tables, have somebody teach, they ask questions, and they encourage conversation. Again, God just put these things together, which I just love, had no idea about. This is me teaching at this class. The guy actually right here, he's an atheist. He was irritated that I was there, and he was irritated because how could I leave my family? And what if I died here? And he couldn't understand why someone would do that, and it irritated him. And we got in a conversation, and I shared with it, because the values in my home are we love God with all our heart, mind, and soul, and we love our neighbor as ourselves. And that's what we believe as a family and as a church. And he didn't like that answer, but it led to more conversation. In fact, he runs it's funny, he's an atheist. He runs their table tennis night that they do on Friday nights for the men in the neighborhood. And they've given him, Sasha is his name. He comes and opens up the door and they play table tennis. And he invited me back to the table tennis night. And we talked for 2 hours. This is a picture taken after the table tennis night. And I got to share with him, said, Sasha, God's doing something in you. You're exactly where my dad was 30 years ago. And I promise you, I respect the fact you're willing to have these conversations. And if you lean into this, I promise you, Jesus will reveal himself. And Sasha didn't give his life to Christ, but this partnership between me being there and disrupting and us being there and you guys allowing us to go and be there disrupted his worldview just enough that creates more conversation for Oleg and Andre to have with Sasha along the way. And so, this is what we saw. Time and time again. This is what we saw. Soldiers and civilians, atheists and followers of Jesus living this reality. And the thing that I got to experience over and over and over again was watching the church, regular followers of Jesus, just step into this space in the midst of their own chaos and say, how can we serve in the name of Jesus families like this? So what is next for us? Well, there is a possibility of future trips. God had kind of confirmed that in me, that I'll most likely be leading some trips back over there. Now, these won't just be, hey, anybody sign up for this trip? Let's go to a war-torn country together. This will be curated groups, some of those to go to the front lines with David and other connections and gospel community. And I love the partnership that God is forming there with a local church, even in our area here. And there's just some kindred spirits there of what God is doing. And so I see us in going to future trips, delivering things. We may go in the winter when soldiers and civilians need cold weather gear and things like that. Go to the front lines, say God sees you, he cares for you, that type of stuff. Pray with them, do those types of things. But the fact that we have the connections on the ground that we have, we know what's gonna be needed. We know what they're actually, the Davids of the world of Ukraine are gonna be able to tell us, this is what's actually needed on the ground. The other space that may be there, and this is just us praying through, we're nothing set in stone, but going, God, is there a spot for us to bring over, like professional counselors and caregivers who can go to the Moseses who are serving and give them a place to process their own grief, their own trauma, their own stuff so that they can continue to be what they need to be in there. And so we're praying through and asking God the possibility of what the future trips are supposed to look like, but there will be most likely future trips as we walk through. Other things we see is continue the financial support. So we have Be Rich, and if you're not aware of what Be Rich is, it comes from this passage. We get the name from this passage. Command them, speaking to followers of Jesus, command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. And so we have a fund set aside that whenever you give to Be Rich, that not 1 cent of that money stays within, goes to Blue Ridge at all. It all goes to outside organizations and people, and that's both locally, places like the Agape Center or the Isaiah House or the Blue Ridge Pregnancy Centers or things like that we've partnered with in the past, organizations like that. But it goes beyond that to outside of just our local area, Puerto Rico. We've done stuff with that, Nicaragua, Sierra Leone, Nepal. I mean, there's all sorts of things, and in Ukraine. And so there's a way for us to practically continue to help hold up the arms there. But really, the biggest thing for me as a church is this third thing. And this is a question for each one of us to ask. What's your next yes? What's my next yes? See, what I got to see over and over again were followers of Jesus in some of the hardest conditions, the most extreme situations, say yes to Jesus in extraordinary way after extraordinary way after extraordinary way. And I love Blue Ridge. And I love the country we live in, and I don't want to be at war with anyone. I don't want to have to make those decisions. I don't want to have to do those kinds of things. Even though it inspired my heart, I never want to have to make that decision for my own family. That said, I think there are things for us to learn. And one of those things is sometimes God asks us to do scary, risky things. He doesn't ask us to sacrifice just for the sake of sacrificing. He says obedience is better than sacrifice, actually. But sometimes those steps of obedience he asks us into, those yeses he asks us to give, they're risky, they're scary, they're sacrificial. What's the yes that God's asking of you? Is there one that you've kind of pushed aside because it seemed too risky, too irrational, too sacrificial? I want to be a church. I want to be a part of a church. I want to be a follower of Jesus that says, okay, I'm not just gonna go out and be a cowboy for cowboy's sake. But I am going to, for the sake of the gospel, be willing to set aside my own comfort. And that we are a community that's setting aside our own desires for comfort to sacrifice for the sake of the people all around us. And for most of us, that's not gonna be Ukraine, but it doesn't mean it's not risky. Doesn't mean it's not gonna require sacrifice. It doesn't mean there's not gonna be an element of relational or even physical danger. What has Jesus been asking you to say yes to that you've kind of been pushing aside because too risky, too scary, too sacrificial? Would you close your eyes? And I'm gonna pray over us in a moment, but right now I just wanna ask, if there is something that you've been pushing aside, would you take your hands right now, and I'm not gonna ask you to raise them, just ask you to open them up. Is there something, or maybe you're not sure, but you think there is, you're not sure if it's God or not, but there is a yes you think you've been ignoring. Would you just simply open up your hands as an opportunity to say to God right now, before I pray over us, God, I'm willing. I'm willing to take whatever the next step is. So Jesus, my eyes are closed. I don't even know how many hands are open right now. But I thank you for this church. I thank you for your church, Global, but I thank you specifically for Blue Ridge Community Church. I have benefited so much from being a part of this community of faith for the last 23 years. I don't know where I would be in my relationship with God without the relationships that you've put around me. I am so grateful that you brought me and my family here. But God, I do want to pray for us. I pray that those of us who are willing to open our hands would be serious. We'd be willing to say, Jesus, there is this thing I've been pushing aside, I've been ignoring. It's scary, it's hard, it's sacrificial, it maybe even be relationally, emotionally, financially dangerous. But I believe it's something you might be asking me to do. And so in faith, I'm opening my hands because I'm willing to say yes. God, I want to be a part. I want to be a person that doesn't just do this one time, but that lives my life in such a way where I'm constantly saying yes, not to necessarily the most sacrificial thing, but to the thing you're inviting me into. God, would that be us as a church? Would we learn from the people we've heard from, we've seen in the stories we've experienced? Would they be inspirations to us as Hebrews talks about, since you're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us run with perseverance the race set out before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured this cross, scorning its shame, and now sits down at the right hand of the throne of God. Would we fix our eyes on you and the race you have for us? And will we be willing to model what yeses look like, no matter how scary, no matter how sacrificial they might be? God, we pray for our brothers and sisters in Ukraine. Would you continue to encourage them and lift them up and give them the endurance and the perseverance that they need to be the hands and feet of Jesus in the midst of what feels like an impossible situation. Jesus, we thank you for you. It's in your name we pray. Amen. We love you guys and hope you have a great week, guys.